Here we go, another of the architecting for the cloud, one pattern at a time. This time we'll be talking all about the external configuration pattern and the claim check pattern. What are they, you ask, and how do I use them? Well, stick around as we find out all about those in today's episode. Hello there, welcome back to another episode of Cloud with Chris. You're with me, Chris Reddington, and here we talk about all things cloud. Now, as we mentioned in the introduction there, we are, of course, in another episode of Architecting for the Cloud, one pattern at a time. And I feel like I'm lying to you again because it's not one pattern, it is two. The external configuration pattern and the claim check pattern. Two interesting patterns that I guess don't really relate to as much to some of the topics that Peter and I have been talking about, because I am once again joined by Peter and we won't be necessarily covering some of those other topics, facades, etc. in as much detail today, though I'm sure we'll probably get them in at some point. So without further ado, I think it's time for us to go and switch over to the other screen and introduce Peter. Hello, Peter. How are you doing, sir?
Doing great, Chris. Thank you for having me back.
Oh, glad to have you back. And I see you've in a nice sunny background there, according to your background at least.
Yeah, definitely. Our one of our conversations around either having a moat around a castle or a speakeasy, and I figured let's just have a little bit of fun with that.
So you're taking it to the extreme. You've got your castle and your fortifications. Don't worry, it's not going to be that scary. We don't need to be heavily fortified for this one. It's all good. It's all good. So, yeah, we're going to be covering two different patterns here today. We're going to be covering external configuration. We're going to be talking about the claim check pattern as well. And I guess these two don't, I mean, all of these patterns will likely relate in some way, right? But directly to the things we talked about previously, it's not the direct relation of APIs per se, is it? There's probably a more broader relationship there.
True. With APIs, obviously, you do want to have some kind of configuration aside, and we're going to talk about that. The other is interesting. The claim check, there may be some references to the external config, and so there's some little bit of interdependency between the two, but it's not as much. It was not as prevalent as the previous patterns, and so our story has kind of deviated. So I figured, let's just change my background and be able to have that as a conversation.
Why not? Let's do it. So I guess at this point then I'll bring up the screen and we'll switch over here. So I think we're first going to kick off with external configuration. So maybe let's start with some scene setting and think about this here.
Yeah, but just for a little bit of fun, I did create a dynamic a bingo card. And so based upon this, you and anyone listening and watching on the video versus your podcast, you can have some fun with this. Keep in mind, I think this is session number 33 with you. So it's just obviously some of the things that we've talked about in the fun times on our previous calls. But with that being said, the external config store, and as I always mention in previous episodes with you, security, right? Each design pattern, each type of implementation, ensure you understand what does that mean to your security posture.
I just have one question before we jump into security. Looking at your bingo card, secure is listed. Does that count? Am I able to have like variations on the noun here?
Sure, you could definitely do inflections or any kind of derivation of the word.
I am taking this bingo card very seriously now. I've got it up on my screen, ready to go.
If you like, I could post the URL, and it will automatically generate a new bingo number.
Oh, I've got one. I've got one. I stole the URL when you were viewing it.
Perfect. And it should reset. And some of the phrasing that we've used in the past, I think there's the R word in there somewhere. And I think in one of your episodes, you called us the dynamic duo.
I did. I haven't said it today yet, though, so we'll see if it gets there or not. Anyway, I interrupted. Yeah, sorry, please continue.
No, it's all good. And so that being said, so security, right? Because these design patterns may have some form of implementation whether it's code or an Azure service that provides this level of feature sets and those type of things. Just understanding what does that mean to your security posture all up. And for the external configuration store pattern, that is one area with respect to security that you definitely want to keep in mind.
Sure.
And so that being said, yeah, so for me, I was trying to correlate our series, right? And so we've been talking about APIs. We've been talking about other type of design patterns. And you've had your own series on various design patterns that you've introduced on your channel. And trying to correlate that, right? You at some point there will be a data store.
Yes.
Whether that's a SQL database, a Cosmos database, or a document or NoSQL database, or even a storage account, a service bus, a queue mechanism in essence, or a topic, or anything along those lines. And there's connection strings that will be needed for your application to interface with them. There is a typical posture or motion that I've seen developers go through, and that is, let me just quickly validate this and keep the connection string in code, hard-coded string.
Yep.
I've done it.
I've done it. Yep.
But,
I've done it.
For RAD, a rapid application development mindset, that's an old, and I didn't have that in the bingo card. Anyway, and so that being said, just understanding the sensitivity of any kind of connection string or any kind of credentials that you will be storing or needed in your application, where would you place that sensitive information? So I don't want to go into implementation just yet, right? Because typically external config store, real simple, right? If we're doing a pop quiz, Azure Key Vault or Azure application configuration, right? Or app.
Yep.
Done. Easy. Check.
Not
I'm done.
in your
I don't have
source
to
code.
deal with any of this stuff.
Not in your source code. I'm going to say it one more time. Not in your source code. It's very easily done, right? Just to come back to your points about rapid application development and, putting it in the code. Yes, for local development, sure, you probably have some connection strings or secrets or whatever. Fine, no problem. Hopefully they're not the production ones, but we'll skip past that point. Make sure you don't accidentally commit them to your version control. It's very, very easily done. I've done it. I'm sure others have done it. It's very easily done. So just be careful on that.
And if you do, and you do it on your first commit, and this is your seed, delete the database or your Git repo or whatever, rebuild it, because you will have that in your history commits. And if your repo is available publicly, for example, in most cases, you're going to want to have a cloud of kind of a crowdsourcing or an open source development model. That's a bad thing. A lot of cyber criminals use that and try to reverse engineer. So hence, this external configuration store addresses several things. Security top of mind for me, and hence I did put that on the bingo card. And then if we don't, like I mentioned, don't think of implementation, but people go, hey, doesn't Azure PaaS, like web apps and function apps, have an application configuration and source code? Yes, and that is in essence an external config store. There are caveats, right? Beautiful functionality with the deployment slots, etc. But if you ever written code or worked in code bases that predate your birth year, you could go old school. What do you mean by that? Can you store configuration values in a database table in your database? Yes. Yes, you can. And I've done that many, many times. Typical same challenges that we're going to talk about here. And so that being said, let's get into it. Something I'm going to be saying right away. If we think about the high cohesion and low coupling,
2 for 1.
What I know. You got a 2-for-1. It was funny when I was designing sorry for the readers going, what are they going back and forth on the bingo card? and this, I try to keep dynamic duo in the middle just to see it, or cloud Chris, and it just didn't allow it. So sorry. I couldn't do a star in the middle. So that being said, where are you storing these credentials? And as I mentioned, high cohesion, low coupling, you have some type of application code that will be doing reads typically from that external config store. And you're not going to do writes typically because of potential requirements. For example, in NIST, which is a secure type framework, separations of duties, what persona can manage sensitive information, and what persona can deploy application source code.
Yes.
So if you want to definitely separate those things, so or those duties, to align with the security requirements.
Yep. No, it makes complete sense. Complete sense. And just jumping back to something that you said earlier as well about app service. And the fact that it has this configuration store built into it as well, which again, great set of functionality, makes it really easy to consume those connection strings or secrets there, even across their different slots as well. Challenges though is, and this is kind of going into a implementation detail, but stick with me. If you think about something like an app service, if I want to go and load test that app service, typically what we say is don't have it all on the same app service plan, because that's the same underlying infrastructure. So when you start getting to that point, you need different app service plans, different apps, can't share the same configuration. You need some kind of externalized central store, which is exactly what this pattern then goes back to, isn't it?
Yes, yes. And I don't want to get into the implementation.
Sure.
It's so tempting to jump in
exactly.
there. I would love to. I know it's like that's one area, is then roles and the RBAC permissions of your app service. It becomes a little bit dicey. And so that being said, if you have a function app, yes, that possibly aligns with RAD, right? But at a certain point, you're going to have to, RAD meaning rapid application development. But if you want to become or make your entire DevOps or your SDLC much more robust, an external config store starts making more sense to align with multiple applications, right? And so the context and the problem is kind of what I'm addressing. The improved application uptime. And this is one thing that a lot of people like myself had to kind of learn by doing. Oh, let me just make a quick change to my web or app config. Guess what happens?
Not good things.
Don't do it in production. That's all I got to say. Do it on your local machine. Take a look at what the impact is. Newer frameworks may have minimized that impact, and that is a reset. And in some frameworks, it's not only a reset, a shadow copy, et cetera, and so you have to go through a few little bit more hoops. So what does that mean? You could make a configuration change, and the application will continue to run uninterrupted. Next time it needs to read from the configuration store to access a data store, done, easy, right? So in this document, I think there is a diagram.
Yep.
Just so we could at least speak to it.
Cool.
And that is my mouse acting up on me. When I scroll down, it wants to go up just a little bit. So I apologize for that.
All good.
All good, yes. And so understanding the applications to an external config store is one of the areas where you have to talk about requirements, separation of duty, NIST, and security. In essence, if you have a series of applications accessing an external configuration store, and each of these applications may be dev test, prod, QA, UAT, is that one external configuration store for each of those environments a good thing to have? That would be a pop quiz.
It's going to depend, isn't it, right, on whether you can have segregation or not within your store.
Correct.
So it will slightly depend on the implementation detail.
Correct. And then how do you define the configurations for each of those environments. Will you have a namespace? Will you have
Right.
um, some kind of scope or some kind of metadata, a label? Get the idea.
Yep. Yep.
And so it becomes it becomes easy when you have a great service such as Azure Key Vault. Azure App Config has a few nice bits
Yes.
that are implemented that can address something, right?
Mm.
So think of what you were describing. If you have an app service and it's going to be the underlying compute and memory for your application, that's one thing. But are you going to have an external config store for an application or for a group? And you have maybe two different environments. So do you have two? And then what does that do to your CI/CD pipeline? What does that do to your SDLC? What does that do to your databases that will be connected as part of the application process? More importantly, do you need to rotate or change a token as part of that configuration store? Service bus, storage accounts, you could rotate the key. Now, how do you rotate the key and update the config store? Do you use automation, right? There are many, many things. So I see you kind of your gears turning there, Chris. Just trying to understand that from your side.
Yeah, no. I was just kind of thinking of, as you were explaining, all the different angles that you need to consider it from. And, something I've mentioned on the show before is about blast radius, for example. And, if something goes wrong, so if someone somehow managed to compromise the config store, what happens and how you segregate them that way. But not just that type of blast radius, but also what happens, someone brand new comes to the team, thinks they're doing the right thing, but they've put the wrong name in or the wrong label or whatever it is, and they've gone and wiped out your configuration store for production. How do you protect against those things? And it's,
right.
Ultimately, I think it comes back a bit like resource groups when we think about that classic guidance there about grouping together resources that are on the same life cycle and have the same roles and responsibilities of people managing them, right? I think it's that same concept, really, isn't it? And those two angles, think about those. How do they impact the additional complexity of your deployments, etc., and then make the judgment call based upon that, I think.
Yep, definitely. This external config store does supply a great functionality called A/B testing or kill switch, right? Will your external config store support that as one of your requirements? Azure Application Config or App Config has that built in. Labels. It's feature rich, right? But is that required? Or do you still continue the old school, have a table, and the table will have a series of columns, rows, and it'll have versions, dates, valid to and from. And I've done a ton of A/B testing through that methodology. However, what does that impact, right? If the external config store takes up much more compute and data than your application or your database, you may want to rethink that.
Yep. Your configuration store shouldn't be costing you more than your application. That's probably a bit of a red flag there. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And then the other is if the external config store cannot keep up with demand, then where do you cache? What do you cache? Remember, as I was mentioned at the beginning, your external config store has a target. Then it is your credential store for sensitive information.
Yep.
So it becomes much more of a critical asset in your application solution.
And it's not just about necessarily people trying to steal from that when you say it's a target. I think it's also about the fact that, hey, let's try and overwhelm that central store so we degrade the entire solution, and then you're potentially losing money because your application's not available, for example. It's that kind of thought process to it as well. It's not the direct impact, it's also that indirect impact as a result of that.
Exactly. And so keep in mind, yes, Azure is a cloud, and typically you think it's unlimited set of resources. There are limitations on the number of Azure Key Vaults and Azure App Configs that you can't provision in a subscription. So just keep that in mind. Proper planning, and then understanding how flexible can you be. Remember that decomposition that we talked about? Do we think of your external config store when you don't have a good design up front? Can you start creating a facade? Possibly, right? As you start moving configurations from one store to another, can you start to support that migration or that removal of dev test in your prod config store? Should something like that happen? But having an impact analysis, you could have diagnostics, understand what is being logged, telemetry, that kind of information. So keep in mind your external config store, and just like your application evolves, just be aware of what those impacts are.
Yep. No, it makes sense.
And then the other thing is, should an accident occur, do you require soft delete? I don't know. Do you require a way to bring it back? And if so, is that something the business needs?
Yes.
So
yeah, additional requirements there and considerations, because all of that is going to influence that implementation detail. And I know we don't want to go too much into the weeds on implementation, but it will start impacting. Right, you need to go this way or this way and consider these aspects. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. And the considerations in this document that I'm sharing on the screen for the readers, there are many, many, many considerations. I'm going to boil them down to a few here and there, and then we could kind of have kind of just thought patterns. For me, working in older environments, I had a database table, right? I had possibly a storage account or some kind of unstructured data store. Great. It allowed me to have complex data composition of my configuration. However, just want to make sure you're still there.
Yep,
your camera
I am still here. My camera
Perfect.
has decided to turn off right now, but continue and I'll sort that in the background.
Not a problem. Okay, just want to make sure we're still here. And if you are still playing with that bingo card, just keep in mind of various things I might be bringing up. And so that soft delete, right? What are the limitations of your store and how will it affect your performance? So ensuring performance, high availability, robustness. Do you require a backup and or a versioning feature? And so from an implementation, yes, Azure Key Vault may have those versioning capabilities, a soft delete capability. However, how do you back up, right? And if you are using a NIST kind of requirement, who's doing that work? So the developer writing the code should be separated from that duty. In small shops, that doesn't happen. I get it. And then the flexibility of that data store, right, from a data schema perspective. So string-based key value pairs. How fun have you seen that from your side, Chris? When you have a string key value pair, there are considerations there, right?
Well, yeah, I think the main one is going to be, right, if it's as a string, how are you representing that? Because you could have it, string could perfectly be like a JSON object, right? You could just represent an object as a string. But if you're talking about one single string representing a key value, then where do you delimit the key from the value? And I've seen loads of different strange and wonderful and interesting implementations there, and something you need to be careful with. I think consistency is really an important piece there when you get to that level of depth.
Exactly. The other thing is that level of scope that I've mentioned, right? That is, if you have a business unit and the application for that business may need an override ability or some kind of config settings there's some complexity here, and there are in this document, it's like as I mentioned, there are many considerations. So definitely pursue that, because the this particular one consideration is complex, right?
Mhm.
And that is, how do you interface with the external configuration store, the implementation? How do you control the scoping and the inherence of that configuration setting?
Yep.
Is the essence of one of these statements in here. Um, and how does that impact your application design, right?
Yeah.
So you're going to have an application. You're going to have XYZ type of requirement, and you're going to say, I want to use an external config store.
Mhm.
There's going to be technical debt. Once you start writing any line of code, you got technical debt. And so what does that mean for, should you need to modify your namespace, your naming convention of your key? Do you need to rebuild the external config store to support that? It becomes more like a dance, an orchestration.
And I think it does depend on how you've implemented it in the application as well, right? Like I've seen certain scenarios where people will pull configuration in during runtime because there's a requirement that drives them to do that. There are some that do it on startup and store it locally in memory or on the machine somehow. For example, both work. Again, requirements will kind of drive what way you go. But ultimately, it will also then start driving some of those aspects you just mentioned there, Peter, as well.
Yeah. The as I mentioned about security, so if you're going to cache, right? This diagram has a great kind of a cache little aside there. Do you do that in memory? Do you want to ensure there are no footprint signature of any kind
Yeah.
of sensitive data? Um, if it is sensitive, how often do you refresh that particular cache value, ensuring that digital traces are gone? That becomes a much more complex scenario.
And also, when you said about refreshing as well, refreshing the original credential and then making sure that cache is purged so you're not getting an accidental old token being used in your configuration as well and causing some upstream application failure then is another challenge.
Yep.
Lots of
Yeah.
coordination.
Yeah. Exactly. As I mentioned, let's use Azure Key Vault. Let's slow down a little bit and make sure you're in a good spot from a requirements perspective, and then just be able to adjust. The other is the personas, right? As I was mentioning, the not the RBAC, but just who has access, what kind of access, having separation of dev, test, and prod. That's what I typically make a recommendation immediately, right out of the gate. Um, and at least you start on the right foot forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's similar in kind of the Kubernetes space when we talk about like physical isolation versus logical isolation. And it's that same idea, right? In theory, with something like app config, because we've bounced it around a few times, you could use something like labels to determine the different environments. But would you want to do that, or would you want to have the physical isolation between the prod and the non-prod? Same kind of concept there. I would probably choose the physical isolation between prod and non-prod, just for my own warm and fuzzy feeling more than anything, and probably the separation of role-based access more so. Um, yeah, again, implementation detail is kind of important just to understand. Can you have that granularity of role-based access control based on a key or a label or a tag, and ultimately just understanding the access patterns. I think there.
Yeah, and from that physical nature, I'm glad you brought that up. Do you need an HSM to support a true hardware separation?
Yeah.
And I believe in FIPS that may be a requirement for banking type of industries. There need to be a true physical separation. So that becomes another challenge. To that, what does the SDLC, as I think I've mentioned earlier, what is the SDLC of the application for the configuration and the value and the rotation? And if the application no longer needs that feature, is this an orphan key and value? or some kind of configuration all up.
Yep.
What does that mean?
Indeed. Lots to consider.
And I'm going to scroll down in this document just so we could quickly take a look. As I mentioned, there are many, if you are watching the YouTube video, there are many considerations in this document.
There really are.
And then when to use, right? It's pretty straightforward from my perspective. Having a configuration settings that are shared between multiple applications, instances, et cetera, that's a great use case. Now then the complexity is that application needs this application needs this, then do you have a different namespace as a key, right, as a prefix or something like that to ensure because you're going to have shared keys or shared configurations and some configurations that may not be shared. So how do you ensure you are make that separation in that configuration store?
Gotcha.
And then the if there are complex data types for configurations, no images, please. That'd be kind of cool if there's an image that could represent a configuration, like a rabbit versus a duck, and then you could say in your logic, is rabbit, is duck, and then anyway, joking aside, I don't have that in my bingo card. Sorry. Just trying to pontificate. I could see Chris just pondering that.
I had lost you momentarily, but I was playing with my camera to bring it back, so I'm gonna blame that. That's what I'm gonna blame.
Right. All right. And then in this document, this example code uses a much more of a, I wouldn't call it low tech. It would be the cost the cost to have an Azure storage as your external config store, pretty cheap, right? It has a high level of IOPS. That means IO requests per second. And the source code has all of this as a way to use a storage account. Now you will need to define your schema.
Yes.
In this code base, you have a cache aside pattern. I think we had that as previous.
Yep. Indeed.
Conversation in the past, you or with someone else, I think, or with yourself. I'm trying to remember. I have your own.
It was just me. Yeah, that one. Yep.
Yeah. And so it's pretty good code. And if anyone remembers the days of having configuration transformations in .NET, right? That becomes a challenge. Your CI/CD is great, right? The XSLT and XML support for transformations, love it. However, does that really help in this situation? Because as I mentioned, if you make a change, it will reload the application.
I really
so you
don't
have
want
to go
say it, but you're reminding me of a word on your bingo card: integrations.
I forgot about that one. Yes, and that was technically for this next design pattern, just for in case anyone's really paying attention. But you found you found something very, very clever.
There we go.
You actually memorized the words, huh?
No. I've got my own screen up here. I'm playing along.
Okay, perfect. Got it. I was tempted to have this on the side, and as I was going through the top. All right. And so the rest of the code is just pretty much how do you work with the latest value? How do you read and write to the data store?
Yep.
How do you extract the list? And then, right, it's just for that notification. It's just, this code is pretty clever. It's already built for you. And so if you want to use an Azure Storage Account, go for it. If you need a feature flag or anything like that, or that is something you may want to consider. As I mentioned, there is a lot of code here. And so I'm not going to go through everything in the code because it will require someone that's listening to actually want to see the code. That's at least how I work when I read code and have somebody talking about, oh yeah, you're going to be using some kind of generics and you're going to be using some kind of external configuration manager, blah, 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 blah.
But I think ultimately, anyway, we're here to talk about the pattern, right? And I think we've already hinted, there are things like app config, key vaults, which already solve this, and you can always build your own, right? But I think like anything, you've got to evaluate do you want to take the overhead of having to manage that, or do you want to use a service where there are people day in, day out who actually, their time and energy is dedicated to building that thing, right? And I
Correct.
know the approach that I would choose, put it that way.
After written many and supporting many
Hmm.
different type of environments in my past, I would have loved to have Azure App Config, to be honest. But
Yeah.
yeah.
It's like that age-old discussion of why would I hold my own identities anymore, right? When you've got things like B2C, for example, where there's that risk of you not necessarily thinking through all options and potentially leaving a hole in your configuration store, for example. That's not something you want to wake up to. So, yeah,
Exactly.
security.
Exactly.
Mentioning it again for you. Security.
Security, exactly. Yeah, and yeah, the external config store becomes a high valued asset,
Yeah.
right? And so, ensuring you have some kind of security hardening measure or some kind of logging and monitoring measure to make sure it's not compromised or it's the requests haven't.
Hmm.
There's no anomaly in terms of the number of requests in terms of trying, because there is a connection. There is a managed identity for Azure Key Vault that you can use with your app to ensure service type communications. We don't going to go into identity and
No,
implementation, but
no, no.
just be aware of what are your security options for whichever implementation you go with, and and then go continue and see where you are. There in this document, there is a great way to do that with an Azure storage account. Is that going to satisfy all your requirements?
Evaluate
Love
that.
to love to hear that in the comments, right, for this
Yeah.
particular video.
Yeah. Good. Just conscious of our time. We've spent a bit of time on that one. We should probably
Well,
speed
I
up
know that one's a
for
big
claim
one.
check. It is,
Um,
isn't it? It sounds so simple, but actually, when you get
I
into
know.
depth with it, it's there's a lot to consider. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's do a rapid fire of claim check,
Hmm.
or do you? Huh?
No, let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. Pretty simple.
Yeah.
The claim check pattern is in essence a messaging based architecture or aligns with that, right?
Yes.
And if we think about your enterprise integration patterns, the document, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. And so the document has a way to have a way to something popped up on my screen.
No, you're good.
Distractions, as they say, squirrel. So the message comes in. You want to process that message, but that processing may go down a different path. And so what does that, or maybe a different path in terms of how does it get split up,
Mhm.
so that way it doesn't inundate the messaging services that you may have provisioned, Azure Service Bus,
Yep.
Azure Store, Azure's queues, etc.
Or maybe even the
Because you
message is
don't want
too
to
large to be
really,
handled as
yeah,
well.
you don't want a really big message because there are limits for message size
Yep.
for each of these types of services. Just make sure you're there,
Yep.
right? And so, in essence, you're going to split this large message into two parts: a claim check and the payload, or in essence, the meat and potatoes of the
Mm.
message. Processing of it, protecting it, the actual message bus, as I mentioned, from a performance degradation. So you could also reduce cost because storage becomes cheaper. So when I started exploring this one, I was thinking about durable functions. It offloads
Yep.
data into
Storage.
a data store.
Yep.
So it becomes a state engine.
Yep.
So don't think the claim check pattern is the state engine. It is a way to support a state engine.
It's effectively a pointer, right? It's
Mhm.
hey, I'm just a message which is saying here's a thing that you need to go and do. I'm not actually the thing that needs to have that thing done to it though. That thing really is over there. I'm just telling you it's over there. So you go work with that thing and just I'm here just to tell all of your dependent services that I'm a thing that needs to happen. That's effectively it, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And as I mentioned, in many conversations, including on this one, high cohesion and low coupling, right? So what we're trying to do is saying, hey, we have in essence a claim check. I'm going to use another word, a correlation ID.
Nice.
And you have a correlation ID that allows you to understand the various systems that will process parts of the message, et cetera, and then you could restitch that back together, and then you could understand that in particular data lineage of that particular message end to end.
Particularly prevalent in the microservices world, where you no longer have this monolith, and you're going to be one message might be going through 5 different systems. Simple user sign up might be create the user profile, create an inventory object, go and send the welcome message to the user. All of these different microservices might go and do that, but if the user doesn't get that welcome email, okay, we need to investigate, hey, what happened along the way? Oh, look, something failed on this particular service, and it gives you that way to investigate, as you say, that end-to-end flow.
Exactly, and the entry point could be when that correlation or that claim check is the I guess the origin or the root. I don't know. I don't want to use a particular phrasing, and so it's in essence the entry point, right?
Yes.
And so you get that, and that might go on a conveyor belt. But let's use a much more realistic example. I have Azure API management. I have an API request. Here's a correlation ID that is created in the system. Now, the API management may call a series of services in the backend. How do you ensure that message is processed? And how do you ensure the performance and logging and monitoring of that? Because you might have 2 different pathways for that correlation. So the message processing is one, the other is the performance. And as each system may have its own performance monitoring solution associated with it, how can you ensure you could stitch all of that message, not just and yeah
exactly.
And so sometimes fan in fan out comes to mind when I think about this one. And then with all due respect to, there's a great image that I'm sharing on the screen, so for your listeners, definitely watch the video. It shows in essence a data store between consumer and a publisher, or sending application, receiving application is what they're using, and just basically saying, here's a correlation ID, and then you go fetch the data store. Okay, and then issues and considerations, patterns, anti-patterns, or when to use or not to use. Pretty simple. The question that always comes to mind when I think about this is time to live, or TTL. In essence, when do you need to delete the message to minimize operational costs, to facilitate either dead lettering, poisoning of that message because it got corrupted? How do you ensure that data cleanup from the system end to end? Should that be a part of your requirement? When do you do that?
And when you say your message, you're not talking about the direct on the queue piece now, or between those systems. You're talking about that payload piece, right?
On the data store, right? Because you're going to be using some kind of temporary data store or a long-term data store. And so what kind of metadata needs to be deleted as part of that? Overhead in terms of latency, right? Because you are going to be traversing potentially 1 or more data stores. Is that a benefit? I think so for this design pattern based upon your requirements. So for example, if you work with multiple systems in, let's just call an ERP, a customer comes in, places an order. What happens through that order request? It might go through billing, it might go through an order provisioning system, it might go to shipping, it might go through invoicing, et cetera, et cetera. So each of those have to be able to understand what is that correlation between each of those records.
Yes, absolutely.
And so that adds overhead, that adds latency, granted. However, if it requires an asynchronous offloaded processing, great, love it. The overhead and latency really does not impact if there's an async operation there. Message size, as we mentioned earlier, if it exceeds the particular implementation, for example, Azure Service Bus or Azure Queue, right? There's 2 different ones. So I mentioned kind of the Azure Durable Function State Engine. The anti-pattern, meaning when not to use it. If you have very small data payloads.
Do you need to use this pattern, or is it overkill at that point?
Probably not. And so, for example, and then the example down in this document, it talks about Azure Event Grid, automatic claim check generation. In essence, the correlation IDs are automatically generated for you if you use Azure Event Grid. And then there are other examples in this document, and definitely would suggest you to take a look at what does Event Grid, Event Hubs, using a claim check generation with Service Bus. Great source code here. If you are watching the video, notice that there is a 3 line items that says environment.get environment variable. And where did we see that before? I think the external configuration store.
Indeed.
So integrations.
I've already got that one ticked off. I've got that one ticked off already.
Yeah, I know. We can't. You could have more than one bingo card, by the way. I know there are people that use more than one bingo card. All right. Other than that, that's kind of the two. And so understanding when to use a claim check. There are certain different benefits of using it. Do you need to use it for everything? No.
Excellent. And I think that's exactly the same no matter what pattern we talk about, right? There's always a reason to use it. There's always a reason not to use it. And I think ultimately, really just understand in the context of your requirements, what is the purpose of that being there? And if there's not a great reason, does it even need to be there? I think is partly what we could be thinking about there.
Correct.
Excellent. So I think we've well and truly covered both of those. Any kind of closing thoughts here, Peter, for folks as they're listening in and digesting all of that information at all?
Security, right? If the message is going to get poisoned as you're sending it, that's a big deal. Or if that external config store gets compromised, what do you do? How are you aware, or what is your operational model? As we mentioned, security is top of mind, especially in these current days, and so that's just want to make sure everyone's aware of that. Other than that, thank you for having me. I always enjoy having these conversations with you.
Awesome. No, likewise. Thank you, Peter. And I think another great session and a couple of very interesting topics to go and dig into there. And I think I was expecting the config store to be a lighter weight topic, but yeah, there's a lot to it when you start thinking about it. So I think I'd really encourage folks just to listen in and to have a read through those docs, because I think there's a great set of information there. Excellent. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for joining. Appreciate it. So, folks, there we go. We've covered 2 patterns today, external configuration store and the claim check pattern. And as we mentioned, a lot to digest in both of those there. I think both of those we could consider as pretty pivotal if you're building your cloud applications. You know what to do. If you've gone ahead and liked this episode, please go ahead, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because we will have more and more of this type of content coming out. So again, if you're particularly interested in this and you wanted to go more hands-on, that's something we can always do as well. And the way that we know what you want is by liking the episodes, and not just on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, on Google Podcasts, Spotify, and cloudwithchris.com as well, where of course you can go and listen and view the transcript of the episode at the same time as well. So my big thanks once again to Peter. I think that was a brilliant episode, had a lot of fun in this particular one. And until next time, folks, all I have to say is thank you for watching, and bye for now.